For those who seek adventure, this is the Buffalo Roamer Podcast, sharing the people, places, and moments that make a life on the loose worth living.
The thing that's going to stick out to you most is when they open up that plane door. The cold is something like you've never felt.
The jungle's so thick, even if you had a machete, you couldn't get through it.
There's a huge blonde grizzly bear. And when it saw us, this thing put its head down, stomped on the ground, and hissed like an alligator.
I just crossed this brutal stretch of desert, and I was really suffering.
I'm your host, Will Collins. I'm an adventurer, outdoorsman, and roamer of wild places. I've backpacked the Brooks Range, rafted the Grand Canyon, and have canoed from source to sea, both the Mississippi and Yukon rivers. I live for adventure, travel, fresh air, and diving into the unknown. And now, I hope to share my passion with you on the Buffalo Roamer Podcast. All right, episode 52 of Buffalo Roamer Outdoors. Thanks for tuning in. Don't forget to subscribe if you're enjoying the show. Today's podcast is with Ben McGrath. Ben is an author, a writer. He's a writer for New Yorker magazine and also the author of his first book, Riverman, An American Odyssey is the title. It's the story of Dick Conant, a through paddler, traveler, interesting character, and river folk hero of sorts, as Ben McGrath put it. But truly great book. I really enjoyed reading it and have recommended it to several people. So I reached out to Ben, and he was kind enough to come on, and we chatted about the book and more. So without further ado, episode 52 of Buffalo Roamer Outdoors, Ben McGrath. You said you're just out doing a little windsurfing. If I remember right, I really enjoyed reading your book, Riverman, An American Odyssey. And I believe in the book you mentioned that you live near the water in New York. Is that where you were windsurfing?
Yeah, right on the Hudson River here. Yep. That's
great. Well, yeah, excited to connect. And so you're a writer, and your book, as I mentioned, Riverman, American Odyssey, I found it really fascinating. The story of Dick. Help me with his name. Is it Dick Conant?
Conant, yep.
Okay,
that's right, Dick Conant.
The story of Dick Conant. Obviously, it connected with me on numerous levels, being a canoeist and a paddler, a through paddler as well, paddling many of the same rivers. And I thought that your insight on just his perspective and the nuanced story of the man was fascinating. So I really enjoyed it. How did you? I know the story a bit, but how did you get connected with this story of Dick Conant?
So it was purely by accident, which in retrospect, I think is kind of the best aspect of the story. I had my toddler son with me at the time. This was in 2014, and we had only fairly recently moved to where we live now, which is on the west bank of the Hudson River, about 20 miles north of New York City. And I used to like to take him down to the banks of the river to sort of look for sea glass, kind of skip, throw rocks or whatever. And we went down like we would, and my neighbor poked his head over his stone wall and said, kind of like whistled a little bit and said, "You might want to come meet the guy who's inside my house. He's paddling a canoe from Canada to Florida." And at that point, I looked over and could see the canoe itself tied up to my neighbor's wall, and it was a red plastic canoe, and it was filthy, and it was packed, like heaped with bags and tarps. And I didn't know. I could guess at that point, though I didn't know until I saw it in action the next day, that when he got in it, there was only a few inches of freeboard. He really was riding low on the water. But so we hopped into my neighbor's house, and there's this guy at the head of the table, kind of 300-pound man, big, 6'2", maybe 6'3", in denim overalls and sort of muddy brown boots, and his face is super red, like he's been out in the sun for months coming down the river, and he's just kind of belly laughing as he's telling stories to the guests at my neighbor's house. And that was sort of how it began. At first I was just sort of a little bit awed and dumbstruck, kind of like, trying to go through the map in my head, which wasn't as filled in as it is now. Like, can you get there from here? I was thinking, like, I know you can go down the Hudson River, but to get to Florida, I was imagining that you was going to have to go out, into the ocean at some point. And he quickly disabused me of that idea. And And so at the time, though, I still kind of thought it was just sort of a little bit of a lark, and I had the idea that maybe I would write a tiny article about him.
And at the time, Ben, just to give a little frame of reference here. So at the time, you're a writer for the New Yorker, which you still are, correct?
Correct. Yeah.
And just to give a reference of the book as well, I guess, before we dive into exactly your connection with it, give me like a background. I've read it, obviously, and thoroughly enjoyed it, as I mentioned, but for someone who hasn't quite yet read it, what's the book about? And give me a background kind of the book, and then we can continue with your connection with him if you can.
Yeah. So the long story short is this guy who I met purely by accident, at the foot of the hill where I live, disappeared a few months later, and I got a phone call from some park rangers in North Carolina saying they were investigating a missing boater, and it just came out of the blue. This call, they didn't know anything. They didn't say anything more than just that. They said we're investigating a missing boater, and I quickly put two and two together and remembered back to the moment when I met this strange man in overalls on the bank of the Hudson River in my town. And so the book is sort of the story of me trying to go back and put the pieces together and sort of resurrect his life of adventure, which turned out to be quite extensive. Not just the journey that took him past my house, but the many sort of meandering years that got him to become a river traveler in the first place. But also, this was the fifth of his major river adventures around the country. He'd been sort of crisscrossing the country in a canoe, and so the book is an attempt to sort of reassemble those scattered episodes and make sort of a through line, make a kind of a coherent river trip of his life.
And what was your connection, if any, to the outdoor or the paddling world before being kind of not drawn but sucked into this story almost? What was your connection to the outdoor world yourself?
So I'm really more of a day tripper than a through paddler. We live on the river for a reason. I wanted to have that kind of access to the water, and as soon as we moved here, I bought kayaks and would go out onto the Hudson. And it was important for me, for my kids, I have two sons at the time, I only had one, for them to live on a river and see it. In my mind, I had this idea, even before I met Dick Conant, that living on a big river would be a kind of an imaginative experience, because you could look up and you can look down. You don't know what's coming from one direction. You don't know where you're heading in the other direction. It's sort of expands the sense of what's possible in the world. That was what I had hoped to teach my children by living on a river. So when this guy showed up, it was like the living embodiment of that dream I'd had. It was sort of like, wow, this giant from a distant land just sort of floats down the river and comes, bearing, implausible stories. And it was like too good to be true. I was like, well, so I imagined it at first. I really thought it was a bedtime story. It was like my version of Where the Wild Things Are. It was like, okay, when Santa Claus comes down the river in a canoe, like now when you look out your bedroom window, every time you look at that river, I want you to think about, the mysterious, amazing stories that could be floating down at any minute. And that was sort of how I related to it. I did, when I was in my 20s, I'm 45 now. When I was in my 20s, I did go on like a 10-day canoeing trip through the Everglades with, my best friend growing up actually was an Outward Bound instructor and a Knowles instructor. He hiked the Appalachian Trail when he was a teenager. Much more sort of brave than I am. I'm really, I love to get outside and then I retreat, sort of 3 hours and then I'm back. And the rest of it is all sort of living vicariously through stories.
And what, if you have a niche or a forte, what type of stuff had your writing career been prior to this work? With New Yorker and other stuff, I imagine you had profiled interesting characters before, right?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'd done a fair amount. I mean, the New Yorker is really not known for this, but I had actually done a fair amount of sports writing. And so profiling sort of famous, Kobe Bryant or Manny Ramirez, sort of prominent figures from the world of sports. I'd done my share of, profiling politicians like Michael Bloomberg or something. But also I had always been drawn, I still am, to kind of obsessive people who are obsessed by whatever it is that may drive them, sort of who are a little bit off the main track and whose obsessions can kind of take us in interesting places. So, and there's this section of the magazine called The Talk of the Town in the front where the articles are shorter and they tend to be, they're a little less on the news cycle and a little more kind of mysterious and oddball stories. And so that was how I initially thought of this subject. When he came down the river, I just thought, oh wow, this guy, the guy who's paddling a canoe past my house to Florida, he's a perfect Talk of the Town story, which is just like a one-page item. And that's kind of all I thought it was until I started talking to him. And there was something about him that drew me in. And I spent much more time talking to him than I needed to for the sake of a little article. But I just thought that was all it was ever going to be until he disappeared and I got drawn back into it. And his family reached out to me and said, well, we'd like to start sharing with you some other stuff he's given us over the years.
So after you meet this guy and there's the missing boater report, from my recollection, it's been a while now since I've read the book because I read it right when it came out. I pre-ordered it, so there you go. But basically at the beginning, you're still kind of piecing together exactly what went on, right? And there's still what's the timeline of you meet him, he's missing, and then is there a definitive answer before you go on your journey of piecing things together of what may have happened?
Sure. So the timeline, I meet him, it's Labor Day of 2014, and I end up spending a couple more days with him, tracking him downriver. I read an article about him. That's maybe another week later. About a month after my article comes out, I get an email from him. He's in Delaware. He's at a public library. He's read my story online. I should say, by the way, one of the things that I really was struck by with him was that he had almost no digital footprint. So I met this guy. He was doing something kind of remarkable, seemed extremely intelligent. But then I went back to my computer and could find almost no proof that he really existed. And that was part of what drove me to kind of get to know him more, because it's real hard to get, this guy was 63 years old. It's hard to get to a certain stage in your life and have no trace. We talk about going off the grid. It seemed to me like this guy had been off the grid for his whole life, which was intriguing because, now I feel like we're all trapped by the grid. So then I get the phone call. It's 3 months later when he disappears, and part of what propelled me was this sense oh my gosh, this guy who seemed not even to exist according to the internet, at least when I first met him, has now disappeared 3 months later. If it weren't for the fact that they called me, it would be as if he never existed. He's just going to disappear from the earth and no one's going to know where, that he lived. And that seemed kind of compelling to me. But the park ranger who called me specifically asked me not to interfere. He was like, this is an active investigation. I don't want you to get in touch with anyone because, you're going to mess things up. So I was kind of stuck just privately worrying about him and thinking about it. And so it was, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks after he disappeared, I got a message on the internet from a kind of anonymous account saying, and it turned out to be a friend of the family under an assumed name, saying, I know some of his brothers, they would like to meet you. And so at that point I figured, okay, well, I didn't initiate this exchange. The family reached out to me. I'll go meet these brothers. That was, I don't know, a few weeks after the disappearance. I hadn't heard any more at this point, other than I think after the first 2 days of searching, they were flying helicopters and planes over the area where the canoe was found. And after that, they called off the active search and it went kind of passive, and they were just sort of waiting for leads. They weren't going to spend that much more money looking for this guy. And so I don't know, maybe by the time I really decided to dig in, maybe a month or two had passed since his disappearance. So now we're into the winter. And part of what happened is his brothers handed me these manuscripts, like typed books that he'd written, unpublished, but like hundreds of pages that of his previous trips. And they said, well, maybe you'd be interested in reading these. And what I noticed when I started flipping through the pages of those was that there were all these names in them, like Bob Johnson and Tina Martin or whatever, just the names of people he'd met on his previous trips. And so a light bulb went off in my head, which was, okay, one of the things that's difficult about this guy is he's kind of elusive. He doesn't leave much of a paper trail. On the other hand, if I have these names, I can start calling other people and piecing together their recollections. And so now we have a chance to kind of to pinpoint real things that have happened. And very quickly, I would make these cold calls to the names that appeared in these documents. And I kind of, refined the shtick over time. I felt a little bit like a telemarketer. I'd be like, sorry to bother you, but I'm calling from New York with a strange question. Do you remember a giant man in overalls in a canoe? And like the first few people I called immediately said, are you kidding me? We were just talking about that guy on Wednesday. And in some cases, these were people who had not, it had been 20 years or 15 years since they met him on some riverbank. And it turned out 15 years later, within a week of my phone call, they were still talking about him. And so then I had this sense quickly at that point, like, okay, well, there's this strange duality here, which is on the one hand, this guy basically seems almost not to exist and is kind of at risk of disappearing from the earth with nobody remarking on it. And on the other hand, it seems to me, from early indications, scattered around the country are all these people who are still by word of mouth talking about his legend. Like he's this kind of folk hero who nobody knows about. And then I sort of saw it as my goal to kind of, put that in print and kind of record it for posterity. Sort of like, all right, if this is a folk hero who's out there and people are talking about it, well, I'll connect the dots, I'll make the phone calls, and I'll write it all down, and then he won't be forgotten.
Amazing. And what was it that, I guess, what was it that drew you to this man, this character? Like, what was the first original article, just the general kind of ethos of it, and then was that the same kind of driving feature of the book, or do you understand that kind of what I'm getting at?
Sure. Yeah. So part of what drew me to him from the very beginning was that he had no cause. And when I say that, I mean, like, he wasn't, a lot of people do exotic things or go to great lengths to do stuff. And it's to raise money for breast cancer awareness, or it's because they want to promote, military suicides and call attention to things, or they're doing it as a means of generating attention, partly for themselves, in my opinion, and partly for altruistic reasons. They have a message they want to spread, and they're doing something unusual, which draws attention to their message. And especially as a journalist, I'm kind of overexposed to those people. I feel like, I get a lot of solicitations, basically, whether they're from professional publicists or just from people themselves saying, hey, look at me, I'm doing this thing. It's interesting. Maybe it's my own fault because I've written a lot of stories about people doing eccentric things. I hear from a lot of people doing eccentric things saying, come check me out. And so I was really struck by the fact that this guy, although he was doing such a thing, he had no purpose, so to say, for doing this other than to improve his own life. What he said when he came by on my trip was that he's retired. He was 63 years old, and he retired early, I guess. He told me that he'd had a checkered career, but he was doing it. And so part of what I was driven by at first was I was just curious, like, what is it that makes a guy do something like this alone?
And so he was basically, for the past however many years, he was crisscrossing the country by canoe, rolling into new towns, rolling into new places, restopping in a town, staying for a while, and then moving along and traversing North America or America by canoe, right?
That's right. And what he would do is he would, in between his expeditions, one long trip of his might take a year and a half or a year or something like that. And then in between, he would sort of recharge his batteries, so to speak, and go back. He lived in Montana, in Bozeman, Montana, outside. He said people call it homeless. He didn't consider himself homeless, but he lived outside in what he called a swamp in Bozeman, Montana. But when he would go back to Bozeman, Montana, then he would work at various jobs. He worked at the university there as a janitor. He took graduate school classes. He worked in hospitals. He worked as a bus ticket salesman. He would save up money. He would spend time collating his notes and writing about the trip he just finished for an audience that never was achieved, basically, because his books were unpublished. But so he would finish a trip. He'd go back to Bozeman, rest up, make money again, write about it, and then he'd plan a new trip, and then he'd go again. So he had this kind of double life. And so one of the things that I was interested in as I started researching the book more was learning about the way in which, when he was out on the rivers, he was this extremely boisterous social character. I mentioned before that he was sort of like a folk hero. He was larger than life. He told stories. He was the life of the party. He was very outgoing. When he was in Montana, he was more of a hermit. So he had this kind of almost like Clark Kent Superman thing going on, where he would go back, disappear into the bushes in Montana, kind of lie low, be mostly miserable, plan a trip, crossing the country in a canoe, get on a Greyhound bus, buy a canoe, put in the water, and all of a sudden he'd spring to life again. And it's like almost like, think about those movies, where it's like there's scenes in black and white, and then all of a sudden it's in color. That's sort of the way I became to think about him. His life, sort of like his life in Montana was in black and white, and then he'd get out on the river, and then all of a sudden it's in color again. And so part of what I was drawn to as I continued talking to him and then learning about his life was the way in which this whole social world of the riverbanks in the United States writ large was this whole, sort of a universe of its own. That's really where he lived. He didn't live in Montana. He lived on the riverbank, wherever that may be in the United States, and that was a place where he was a very popular, almost famous person. And it's a place that has its own share of eccentric characters, certainly.
Yeah, no doubt about that. I found that fascinating, and I think I first heard your perspective on it when I just happened to be watching a YouTube or a Facebook Live link, and you had a speech. This is before the book had come out, at Neil Moore's celebration, I guess, whatever you want to call it, of completing his cross country journey via canoe. And you said something that I had intuitively known but never really realized, is just exactly what you said, how there's something to that river life or the river traveling, where you show up into a new town, you don't know anybody, there's no pre-assumed assumptions about the people that are on the riverbank or the person on the river. It's different because you're not rolling up in a car just like everybody else. It's like something interesting and out of the ordinary that people are kind of taken aback by, and it's just an interesting perspective on social connection and societal norms, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, so one of the things I mentioned before, this idea of being off the grid. And so I think when I first met Dick, in my mind, I was drawn to the way in which, he was different from me, because he was going off and living kind of wild style out on the rivers, and I was sort of domestic at home with wife and child. And then also we have this sort of tradition in our own, in American literature, whether it's Into the Wild or whatever, of the person who goes off, the seeker who goes off, separates himself from the kind of the corruption of other people, basically, and goes into the pure thing, which is the wilderness. And so I initially had this idea, so this is a guy who's going off and doing this pure, he's on the rivers, they're beautiful, he's living naturally. I'm doing it, suburb style. What I realized is the difference between maybe someone like the main character of Into the Wild and Dick Conant is Dick was actually an extremely social person. He was not trying to escape people. The rivers were a way of giving him a social life. He was connecting with people again and again by arriving in towns. And sure, he had in between his pit stops in towns, he had a lot of kind of man on nature experiences and a lot of just sort of beauty uncluttered. But he lived for the experiences in the towns where he would meet people and make new friends. And what I learned, one of the things I learned that was sort of almost tragic in its way about his life, but I came to think that he'd solved this problem in an ingenious way, is he was someone who had always been very social as a kid, at least like a popular, beloved figure in his youth. And then things didn't go as well as he wanted, as they don't for many people in his early adulthood and into middle age. And he was finding it hard to maintain friendships, which is something that he'd always had an easy time with as a younger person. And getting in a canoe and going down rivers allowed him to be that popular person that he'd once been again as a child. So it was like a solution to the problem. This was a guy who craved friendship, couldn't really find a way to hang on to it in his normal life, so to speak. And then he went out and became a riverman, and all of a sudden he had friends everywhere. And it was kind of, that was the trick, the life hack, I guess.
And it's just it's an interesting, two-sided coin, I guess, as well, because I remember from the book, there's some people who, for instance, one of the quotes that sticks out to me was one of his, would it have been relatives who said, Dick didn't need a New Yorker article, he needed an intervention, or something along those lines. Whereas
a childhood friend, a friend of the family said that.
Yeah. But it's kind of one of those things where it's like, you look at it and it's a two-sided coin, right? Because it is different, but it seemed like for him, he may have figured it out, maybe not, but it's just, it's interesting.
Yeah. I mean, and I don't know how much your listeners know about the Neil Moore story you alluded to, but Neil Moore is a guy who actually, one of the people whose names appeared in Dick's writing that I then was given after his disappearance. And so I wrote an email to Neil Moore, or just sort of a cold email, and found him. I think he was living in Africa at the time, and he wrote me. And it turned he had met Dick on the Mississippi River in 2009, and he was sort of shaken by the news of Dick's disappearance, and that was part of what inspired him to go on the subsequent trip, where he crossed the whole country west to east in a canoe. And one of the nice things, actually, I'm recording this podcast from my garage. Neil Moore slept in this garage in last December when he was coming down the Hudson River. He came ashore at the exact same spot where Dick Conant came ashore 7 years earlier, as Neil was about to complete his trip. So I felt that there was a nice symmetry there. And so Neil stayed a night with us, just as Dick had stayed with my neighbor
That's funny.
earlier.
You'll be
one of the ways in which there's constant sort of cycle of connections through these stories.
You'll be happy to know that I talked with Neil when he was about halfway through that trip originally, which is now already about 2.5 years ago, which is crazy. But I'm talking with him tomorrow night for another episode. So yeah.
Awesome. Yeah.
So that should be good. So as you're tracing these stories and calling people like Neil, like what are some of the stories or things that people recalled that stuck out to you about him, or just I guess we start there.
Well, a lot of it started with people kind of remarking on his appearance, always the overalls, also the pickled hot dogs, this was one of the things that when I first met him, I kind of imagined again when I was doing this thing where I kind of figured like, oh, well, he's the wilderness man, and I'm the civilized guy. I kind of figured he was fishing for his own crabs or something to eat. And he opened up his cooler to show me, he's like trying to offer me a drink of water or something like that. And he shows me his cooler, and he's got this jar of kosher Franks in pickle juice. And he's like, this is his dietary staple is he uses pickle juice to preserve, kosher dogs, which are like a protein source while he's on the go in case he runs out of ice. The brine solution will preserve it. So I had, I over and over again, people would say, yeah, here, this guy, he had like a toothbrush sticking out of his overall baggage, and he was munching on pickled hot dogs. So that was part of it. But actually, one of the coolest things to me, and it helped kind of inspire my framing of him as this folk hero, was talked to a couple people who had met him on more than one river, right? So they met him by chance on one river, and then like 2 weeks go by and they meet him on another river. And so one of the guys said sort of like, if a river came through your town, you might see him. You just, anytime there's a body of water come through, like you never know. This guy might just be coming down where he goes. The most remarkable one in that context was there was a guy who met him on the Mississippi River north of St. Louis, I think in like the fall of 2009. And they met and they went drinking together, and they exchanged addresses as people generally would with Dick, because he was sort of an avid pen pal. And the guy, turns out he was visiting his parents up north of St. Louis, but he actually lived in the town called Columbus, Mississippi, which is on the Tom Bigby River, not actually part of the same river system as the Mississippi River. It's like, I don't know, 1,500 paddling miles between those two places. And Dick says, "Oh, well, I'll be swinging up there next winter or spring, because when I get down to the Gulf of Mexico, I'm going to go over, and then I'm going to start going upstream on a bunch of those southern rivers on my way to the Atlantic Ocean." And the guy sort of just politely is like, "Oh, all right, yeah, sure." Thinking, of course, that's not going to happen, but nice to meet you. And then like 5 months go by. And of course, because Dick has this guy's address, he arrives in Columbus, Mississippi, like walks off the river, goes wandering into town, finds him, and starts yelling his name. And the guy's like, he's on his couch and he hears someone shouting his name, and he opens the front door, and there is this guy, like, again, the overalls, the hot dogs, the toothbrush, and it's like February, it's cold, and he's just like covered in mud, and he's like, "I'm here." And he ended up staying 4 nights. It's just like, what can you do with that?
So funny. Did you have any interesting or anything that sticks out to your mind from your story and your connection to it, trying to piece together his story? Because as you're trying to connect with people, at first you're questioning even if this, bombastic story or this myth, this ethos of this traveling folk hero could even be true. There's no trace of him, and then you're kind of doing your reporter work and connecting the dots and traveling and talking to people. Anything that sticks out to you in your travels and in like your trials and tribulations of trying to figure out his story?
Well, so there's a few places that are pretty vivid in my mind, but one of the main things I noticed, and it gets to this idea of the kind of the way that the riverbank is this sort of unique social environment, is I went to some really tiny places because I was trying to find some of the smallest towns that he'd visited. And on the Ohio, the sort of the Indiana shore of the Ohio River, there's a lot of towns there that have, like 1 or 2 or 3 dozen people in them. And I went to a string of those places. And in one of them, I think the population was like 14. I'm talking to the mayor of the town, and it's like, we've been talking for 2 hours, and he's like, "Oh, by the way, we got a traveling artist who just showed up here a couple of days ago. He's painting a mural on Pat's barn." And he's about like the canoeing guy. We get a lot of these people. There's kind of like Alaska. The river towns get a lot of these people. And so I went over to meet this guy, and it turns out, this guy is a traveling mural painter who lives basically in the woods. and he goes from town to town up and down rivers and paints murals for people. And he just happened to have been in the town population of 14 the same week that I showed up, just randomly. And so then I went on down the river to another town, a town called Rome, Indiana. Population is like 35, I want to say. And by that, the word had got out about me a little bit. So they were kind of, when I showed up with the manuscripts, they were like, "Oh, you're that guy who's chasing the canoer." But I start talking to this guy who's kind of, had a few, and he's just kind of glassy-eyed and staring out at the river, and he's talking about how he would never leave this town. This is, all you need. But he's like, "But I got to tell you, my cousin, she rowed across the Atlantic Ocean twice." And he's like, "I think that's pretty amazing." And the first time she got rescued, she capsized. She had to get rescued by the Coast Guard. But then she did it again, and now she's on like the short list to go to NASA. Go to Mars for NASA. And I was like, "Wow, that's kind of interesting coincidence." So I tracked her down, and she's like a scientist in New Zealand now. So I emailed her to try and verify his story. Part of this whole process for me was like about like hearing one outlandish story after another, whether it's from Dick Conant or from someone he met, and just sort of like fact checking it and being like, "Did this really happen?" And always the answer was yes, it did happen, and it's even a little more exotic than you think. So I write her, and I was like, "I met your cousin Noel, in Rome, and she was very polite and nice about it. And the only correction she had was that he thought that she was like in the, on the short list for people going to Mars. He thought she was on the top 100, and she was actually in the top 20 or something like that. But anyway, she's like, and she did indeed row across the Atlantic Ocean twice and get rescued by the Coast Guard. But even more to the point, she's like, the funny thing is I just ran a half marathon here in New Zealand. And I was running a half marathon, and this guy comes up beside me, and he's wearing a Tyrannosaurus Rex costume. Like, I'm picturing those like Halloween costumes that are a little bit like, they're like as tall as a person. Like, this guy's running a half marathon next to her in the Tyrannosaurus Rex costume. So of course they strike up a conversation because this is a little bit weird. And it turns out that guy had also rowed across the Atlantic Ocean.
Jeez.
And so she ended the email to me that just said the world is certainly an amazing place. And that was sort of the lesson I took over and over again through my work on this book, is that, the world is an amazing place and people are amazing. And when you find amazing people, they have a way of sort of connecting you to other amazing people, and you just got to keep pulling the thread, and the story keeps going.
Absolutely. I think part of the reason that I've connected with this book, obviously it's a fascinating story, but because I found that to be true myself as well, is paddling rivers and doing this podcast, even talking to interesting people. Then somebody says, "Oh yeah, you should chat with this guy. He, walked around the circumference of the world," or, he is a writer, or whatever it may be. You keep pulling the thread, and there's more interesting stuff that just pops up. It's fascinating. One of the things also that I found interesting about, you talk about going to some of these small towns along the river, and I've done some solo trips, and I always love traveling by myself personally. I think it's just there's something unique about it. You decide when you're hungry, when you're tired. There's no one else to concern with. But especially as you're meeting people, it can lead to some like interesting interactions, or like just a little bit of hint of uneasiness behind all of the pleasantries, and it's like most of the time you can always have a pretty good gauge about usually when you meet somebody, you have a pretty good gauge right away about, their intentions. But sometimes, especially when you're traveling by yourself and on these rivers, there is that little bit of just tension behind there, knowing you're by yourself in this podunk little town in the middle of nowhere. You found that a little bit on your trip. I'm thinking of one specific story, but I'm sure Dick found that as well, maybe.
Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know. Do you want me to recount the story in my own thing, or no?
I guess it doesn't matter. I was just alluding to it, but yeah, you just in your travels, there was, I guess what was the story? I guess that we don't have to.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess it's a little bit, for me going around as a reporter, it's a little bit like for someone like you or Dick going around as an adventurer, which is you're the new guy in a podunk town, and you represent excitement and a sense of opportunity for people. So for people who feel trapped in little towns, and there are obviously just as there are people who are trapped in any places. A new arrival who comes in and is sort of interesting and full of stories and interested in them in the way the new represents something almost dangerously thrilling, because it's like you may be trapped in your small town because you've pissed off too many people, and maybe got a drinking problem or whatever, and you've stepped in it a few too many times, and you think of yourself as a person, of great intelligence and ambition, but you're sort of trapped by your surroundings, and you have no chances for new first impressions, and so you're just sort of, a new person comes in, it's like, all right, now I get to put on my new first impression face again and become the person that I always wanted to be, and so there's something almost a little bit potentially false about that. It's a little bit like, like a love at first sight kind of thing, where it's like you get a little too excited. Like, wow, I got a real great connection with this new person, and it's great until it curdles a little bit. And so in the case that you were alluding to, I was in a place in Tennessee, and there was a guy, a very interesting guy. Dick had written very interesting stories about him. He was difficult to find, but I did finally find him, and he was really excited to be part of the story and to be connected to someone from far away through Dick. But then as our time together wore on, he started drinking more. Some of his problems came more became more apparent to me. And yeah, he was sort of a little too excited by this new relationship, and he was just sort of playing trust games with me, whether he was gonna, hinting that he might steal my car, and it was a little bit frightening in the end. It was one of those moments when I realized the difference between a motel and a hotel is that a hotel has a lobby where they can intercept an unwanted guest, and a motel has no place to defend, and you can't. In a hotel, it's hard to know which of the 200 cars that's parked there belongs to the person in your room. In a motel, you're parked right outside your room, so you can't pretend you're not home. So if someone comes knocking in the middle of the night, as this guy did, I can't pretend that I'm not there because my car is parked right outside my door. But yeah, I think I made a remark about this in the book, where Dick alluded to this a little bit about the sort of deliverance idea of you're in sort of backwoods places. You never know whether that smile that is kind of a sinister smile or just a super friendly smile, and you got to be a little bit wary. In Dick's case, he fended for himself pretty well. He was a very strong, very big man. I think it's a lot harder for women, say, who travel. You hear a lot about this. You have to be really have your wits about you if you're a solo female traveler. If you're a 300-pound guy with a beard and overalls, you can kind of maybe defend yourself a little better.
How was well, obviously you're a writer for your profession, and so that's just what you do. But how was the process of stringing together these stories and like these recollection of facts into a cohesive, interesting story? How I guess I don't know if how was that process, but
it was difficult. Is the short answer. And part of it is because it was, one of the challenges you hope as a writer that you get so excited by the material or the character you're writing about that you can share that enthusiasm with readers and have them kind of begin to feel the same level of excitement. the danger is that you get sort of so inside, you find everything so fascinating that you want to just keep sharing more and more and more and more. And then at a certain, you imagine like I sometimes like, I'll test this stuff out on my wife, and I could see her like starting to turn her away and start doing other stuff. I realize like she's not as interested as I am, and
Sure.
That's a bit of a challenge. But actually, one of the other things is, we talked earlier a little bit about some of the other kinds of articles I'd written for the magazine, and like a lot of times, if you're writing about a prominent person, whether it's a professional athlete or a politician or anyone today, especially, that a lot of the you're trying to write like kind of literature in a nonfiction way, where you're trying to get inside the life of a human being and explain what it's like to be this person, and famous people make that pretty difficult. They have all these walls set up, and everything is a little bit artificial, right? You have these, you have just an interview in a conference room rather than a real window into what's going on in their life. And part of the artifice of writing sort of long form articles for the New Yorker about such people is making it seem, making the reader believe that you've been many more places than you really have been. It's kind of a game of a little bit of like, and so this was the exact opposite, because like I had access to all of his journals. I didn't mention this earlier, but in addition to his brothers sharing some writing with me, we found notations inside the abandoned canoe that he'd been paying rent to storage lockers in Montana and Utah. So with one of his brothers, we went out and we opened those lockers up, and inside those lockers were boxes and boxes and boxes and paintings and journals. He just wrote everything down, and I had access to all of it. So this was a person who was even when I talked to him before he disappeared, he was not at all guarded. He was like a consummate storyteller, sharing everything about his life. And then all of a sudden now he goes missing, and I have all this thousands of pages of his private writings. So now it's the exact opposite problem that I had as a more conventional journalist, where you're trying to make it seem like you have omniscience about this other human being, but in fact, you've only spent 2.5 hours with them over a period of 4 weeks. And now, like, I actually have kind of a bit of omniscience about this guy because he's written everything down. And so it's the opposite. And I was thrilled by that opportunity in some way, but it's the opposite challenge, because now you have everything. So weeding it all, like, it's too much, right, for a reader. For me, like, I could spend months inside this material, and I know it also, like, every little thing is interesting, but the book, I don't know, personally, like once a book goes beyond 300 pages, I start to wish that it were shorter. So yeah, it was hard.
I believe it. Well, I think you did a great job, and I mentioned it, but I really enjoyed it. What after the book is out, and you've been, when was the official published date on this one? It was this summer, wasn't it? April. Okay.
April, yeah.
Okay. So you've been doing some media stuff. What have you found, or what has been meaningful to you, other than people buying it, about people receiving the book, or I'm struggling with the words, but I think you understand my question.
The best thing about it has been the emails I've been getting from complete strangers. In anticipation of this book, I had a friend of mine make a website for me, and so we put the address of the website on the dust jacket of the book, and through that, people who have read the book have been submitting comments to me, and I've been just getting pretty amazing, pretty regularly. Like, a week doesn't, still now it's been several months, a week doesn't go by without me getting several notes from complete strangers. And a lot of them are, some of them are sharing stories about people who they've known in their lives who Dick reminded them of. But some of them have just taken the opportunity to tell me, sort of like stories about their life near some river or somewhere else or something. It's become an invitation for people to tell stories that have any little connecting thread to this. And it's been great. I mean, every time I get a new email through that website, I get excited. It's like, luckily, it's like the difference between social media and like on social media, I don't even have a Facebook page, but people are combative or something. Whereas here, like people, if they're going to seek you out through your own website to write you a note, it's because they want to share something with you rather than to bark at you. So anyway, that's been really gratifying for sure.
That's great. Where's the best place for people to get the book?
Anywhere. I mean, you could get it on Amazon. You could get it at your favorite independent bookstore. You could get it
anywhere.
At Barnes & Noble, I think. You can get it at bookshop.org, which I think is just sort of is a clearinghouse.
Yeah.
But you really, it's funny. People ask me earlier on, sort of whether if there was a place where I preferred that they get it from, and I don't really have a good answer. Anywhere it's convenient for you to buy the book, then I'll be honored for you to give it a try. Perfect.
Awesome. That's great. The title's Riverman, an American Odyssey. Do you have any other thoughts or any other thoughts?
The one other thing I was thinking about, 10 minutes or so ago, another of the things that I learned from Dick through this was, and he learned this himself sort of over the course of over time of his trips, which is, when he started doing this, I think he thought, his first trip was in 1994, 93, something like that, in Idaho on the Salmon River. He thought, like many people who go off and do, wilderness trips and sort of long exposure adventures, I think he thought he was going to find something important out about himself. And he was going to sort of fix what's wrong with his life and so forth. And what he realized over time was that to some extent, he was who he was, and he turned the lens away from himself a little bit over time. So rather than spending all this time sort of searching his own soul in, looking for his own reflection in the river, he was sort of turning his eyes outward and finding pleasure in other people and other places and other things, and not worrying so much about what was wrong with him. As I said, he was who he was. The way to improve his life was to delight in all that the rest of the world had to offer and all the other people who made great conversation and sort of enlivened his brain. And I think, I sort of have taken that to heart a little bit. Again, it's sort of like journalism is about going out and meeting other people rather than endlessly talking about yourself. And so I think that was kind of a nice model that he showed over time. Like the way he wrote about his trips, the first one is like, it's like a slender journal because it's all about his own experience. And then the next time it gets a little fatter, and the next time it's a little fatter. And by his fourth trip, it's like he's written 1,000 pages, and it's not because he's like writing endless stuff about what he, how he's feeling or what he ate. There's some of that in all these things, but it's because he's stuffing the pages with other people's stories. He's like, I met the most amazing person yesterday. Let me write about that. And so he's just collecting stories about other people. So that idea of turning the lens away from yourself and out to the world in front of you was kind of a cool lesson, I thought.
I think that's fascinating, and I appreciate your perspective on all this stuff because it's something that oftentimes I've intuitively felt but haven't necessarily verbalized or thought too much about on a deeper level. But it's exactly true, and I say it on this podcast all the time. Seems like almost every guest we have on, it's like, yeah, it's a little bit different, but the same thing as you were saying is that you go out and you think it's going to be about the woods and the river and the mountains or whatever, but it's the people you meet along the way that make the journey and make the trip. And there's so many fascinating people out there, right? And almost everybody has some sort of story to tell if you're willing to listen, right?
Totally. Yep. That's it.
Fascinating. Well, Ben, hey, thanks again. Really appreciate it. Thanks for the time. And yeah, best of luck. What do you have coming up next? Where can we keep track of your work? Just keep an eye out at the New Yorker?
Yeah, for now, keep an eye out on the New Yorker. Actually, I'm hoping to write another talk of the town story this week about another river traveler who some of you might be familiar with, but I'll wait and see if it comes together first. And otherwise, yeah, I'm kind of, I'm on the lookout for another longer project. The challenge is like this one, he just floated down the river and presented himself at my shore. So it's hard for me to replicate that model. Like I can keep looking out at the river, but like, I'm not sure that another person worthy of a book is going to show up anytime soon. So I might need someone to pop up in my inbox with an idea or something like that. So please, by all means, go to benmcgrath.com and send me a note.
Awesome. I love it. All right, Ben, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And there you have it, episode 52 of Buffalo Roamer Outdoors. You can find out more from Ben at benmcgrath.com. Again, the title of his book, Riverman, An American Odyssey. Thanks for tuning in. Go check out buffaloroamer.com. All kinds of blogs up on that site, trip blogs, fishing blogs. Please subscribe and follow the podcast if you're enjoying the show. That helps us out a lot. Go get outside, get some fresh air. We'll talk to you next time. New episodes first and third Friday of every month.